Well, y'all. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good afternoon, good evening. It doesn't matter what time it is, just know today is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. Why? Well, because as always, God is good and He's good all the time. Ah, man, it was rough. It was rough. I know I'm getting started later than what I anticipated. But y'all, like my mama says, charge my head, not my heart, okay? It's not my intentions. Here in Rochester, New York, we had gotta be at least a foot of snow. You know, I had to help my wife clear out her vehicle so she could get off to work. That mother freaking we had to get some of that snow about that driveway and sidewalk, you know what I'm saying? We had some stuff to do. Had some errands to run, some things to do. Got delayed, but we not denied, y'all. So we are here. We are here, y'all, to read 2 chapters. We are down to the last 3 chapters of Blood at the Root, a racial cleansing. However, we're reading 2 chapters today, and we're going to save the last chapter for another day this week because I got some things to do today. So I'm going to be off in a little bit, but I want to tell y'all something, man. I came across this artist, right? I'm not sure what his name is, but I know it's under Fire Rose Entertainment. And he's out of Rochester 585, you know where I'm from, Rochester, New York, just to be motherfucking exact. Okay. And this gentleman right here, man. This gentleman right here. And we're going to sit back and listen to him sing, doing his thing. All right? Let go. I don't know why it sounds sounding. Oh, this thing is funky. Y'all, we got some technical difficulties. All right. Now, this joke about to start. Bro. Oh, we got Carter. We want to hear from the beginning, my good electronic brother or sister. I'm going to press this button. You better not motherfucking mute again. Oh, you did it again. Oh, you did it again. Stop. It's like it want us to. All right, whatever. Let me play it from the beginning, you motherfucker.
Fire Rose, how they play a God. I want playing on the game. Bad. I want playing on the game. Fire Rose, how we go? God. Hoof them, cuff them, hoof buff them. Hen shoot up like I've hatched them. Mouth shoe bump, the clap box them. Look when them group up. Champ pop head, Fire Rose, mini K it, I go shot them. Boom, 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 boom. How we go? Yeah, me easy if you can circle them with the Mark 10. Fire Rose, how the play go? How we go? Squeeze it, butterfly, easy them on a light. Beat it, I'ma fly them dead lullaby. Squeeze chip on a bike, knee lift when I climb. 3 clips just arrive, beat it. But them lily, bag of nice, last them butterflies. Wheel it on a bike, squeeze it. But from did it, so not try bring me up a life. Fire Rose, we gon' squeeze it, them did that. Circle them and bust them made in a the pillar. Killers and ready them and ya for liquor. Press it up, watch them a glide and did that. Fire Rose, rich like bank teller. We are you no size, or it's a we no similar. Aye, he badness big, yeah, mega. Press it up, them a glide and did that. Fire Rose, bad. March on, we bama. Anyway, them me find them with a punta cana. Should be bama through the wind and them me pull a fire. Cranes up your tail, hot with the think kasana. Had up with them a carry village, you mo focus on. Kasana tell me them already, them a big farmer. Finger.
I'm feeling it, even though they keep using it.
How we go? Fire Rose, how they play a God. I want playing on the game. Bad. I want playing on the game. Fire Rose, how we go? God. Hoof them, cuff them.
I do it every time my motherfucking pause this thing.
Shoe bump, the clap box ask them. Look when them group up, shop pop head for the rose, mini K it, I go shot them. Boom, 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 how we go? Them easy if you circle them with the Mark 10. Fire rose, how the play go? How we go? Squeeze it, butterfly, easy them on a light, beat it. I'ma fly them dead lullaby, squeeze chip on a bike, knee lift, man a climb, tree clip, just arrive, beat it. But them lily, bag of nice, last them butterflies, wheel it on a bike, squeeze it. But from did it, so not try bring me up a life. For the rose, so we gon' squeeze it, them did that. Circle them and bust them made in the pillar. Killers and ready them and ya for liquor. Press it up, watch my glide and did that. For the rose, rich like bank teller. We are you no size, or it's a we no similar. Aye, he badness big, yeah, mega. Press it up, them a glide and a did that. Fire rose, bad. March on with the bomber. Anyway, them me find them kuda punta cana. Should be bomber through the wind and them me pull a fire. Grains up your tail, hotter with the tinkasana. Had to be them a carry village to move focusana. Kasana tell me them not ready, them a big farmer. Finger.
Alright, man. I just wanted to show y'all that, supporting fellow Rochesterians. And y'all make sure you go follow them on Instagram. If I find this song on Spotify, because that's where I listen to my music, I am definitely going to hit him up. I got to figure out how he get his music out, because this little, 1.5 minute clip ain't it. But you can find the link to his profile in the description down below, So, but without further ado, we're going to get into this video. The reading of Blood at the Root, man. You see it. I know this light is kind of bright up here, but Blood at the Root. Oh. We almost there, y'all. Oh, there we go. Blood at the Root by Patrick Phillips. Man, it's been a long time coming. We down to the chapter 16, y'all. You can't see that well. Chapter 16. We got 16, 17, and 18, and then we are done with this book, and we are moving on to the next one. But it was nice, being further educated on some things that happened in the past in Forsyth County, Georgia, you know what I'm saying? And some of these things that happened in the past, although they seem so far removed from us, they still tend to have some residual effect on people alive today, right? You have generations today who have been displaced from land, stripped from land, who would have had access to it if these circumstances didn't transpire. You know what I'm saying? And many people have fought trying to get their land back, and it's very difficult to get it back once it's legally transferred over to somebody else through some form of transaction. It's crazy. But although it seems so far removed, that there's still something that has an effect on people today. So we about to get into it. Let's go. Chapter 16, y'all, is called The Attempted Murder of Miguel Marcelli. All right. There were long periods when Forsyth's prohibition went untested and largely unnoticed, at least by white Georgians. For African Americans, the county's reputation was so well established that it was rare for anyone to make the mistake of straying over the line. Once in a while, a black truck driver from Atlanta or Chattanooga would take the risk of speeding through and simply pray he didn't run out of gas or get a flat tire. But more often than not, black Georgians went far out of their way to avoid Forsyth, even if it meant hours of extra driving or switching assignments with a white coworker or simply refusing to go into the cracker county they'd been warned about since they were children. When my family moved to Forsyth in 1977, and this is the author speaking, Patrick Phillips. When my family moved to Forsyth in 1977, my parents saw coming as an appealing escape from suburban Atlanta, close enough for them to commute to jobs in the city, but far enough away from the county was still pastoral. With its rolling green pastures and quaint town square, our house on Browns Bridge Road was just a few miles west of Oscarville, and while we had heard rumors that Forsyth was home to plenty of racists and Klansmen, the same could be said of almost any rural county in Georgia in the 1970s. At age 7, I had only the vaguest sense that something bad once happened in Forsyth. Had no idea at all that it had begun just a few miles from where we lived. My classmates at Elementary explained to me, the newcomer, why there were no niggers in Forsyth County, the same way their elders had once explained it to Helen Matthews Lewis in the 1930s. And when my Little League team piled into the back of a pickup truck and joined Cummings' 4th of July parade in 1978, I watched a group of Sawney Klansmen stroll along behind us, all wearing their pointy hoods and white robes as they waved and lobbed handfuls of bubble to the crowd. But for all that, Forsyth still seemed normal to me as a kid. It was a quiet, close-knit community, as locals like to say, where boys played football and baseball and where girls rode horses and took ballet. My friend's father spent their weekends fishing and hunting, and on Friday nights you could find almost everyone in the bleachers of the Forsyth County My friend's fathers spent their weekends fishing and hunting, and on Friday nights you could find almost everyone in the bleachers of the Forsyth County High football stadium. I learned to sit silently when my friends told nigger jokes, and to keep my family's liberal views to myself. My parents had grown up in the Birmingham of George Wallace and Bull Connor, and the kind of deep-seated bigotry we found in Forsyth was nothing new to them. My father and mother had fought with their own parents over integration, and they had been taunted by racists as they marched in civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham and Atlanta. In the same way, they told me we were going to help change Forsyth County from within. God bless you. But then in July of 1980, 3 years after we arrived, something happened that I knew wasn't normal at all. I first heard about it when my mother, who worked as a freelance reporter for the Gainesville Times, got a call from her editor, C.B. Hackworth. Hackworth said the night before, there had been a shooting not far from our house, and he asked my mother to drive down to Athens Park Road and try to get the full story. In those days, it wasn't unusual to hear a shotgun blast echoing across Lake Lanier filtering through the pines when some good old boy was hunting whitetail or flushing out quail. So my mother headed toward Athens Park, expecting to learn about a hunting trip gone wrong or a domestic violence case, or maybe just some redneck taking a pot shot at a stray dog. But after spending the afternoon stopping at one house after another, she began to sense that something very different had happened on Athens Park Road the day before. No one would talk about the shooting, and more than a few people slammed the door in her face when they realized why she'd come. Over the course of the next few weeks, she learned the truth, that whites in Forsyth had once again attacked a black man for stepping across the county line. On the morning of July 26, 1980, Miguel Marcelli and his girlfriend, Shirley Webb, were invited to a company picnic thrown by Sophisticated Data Research, the Atlanta-based computer firm where Webb worked. The organizers had chosen to hold the gathering on Lake Lanier, which was a popular weekend playground for young professionals, particularly after an extension of Highway 400 made the lake an easy drive from Northside to Atlanta. Marcelli, a 28-year-old Atlanta firefighter, had been born and raised in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and his girlfriend, Shirley Webb, 37, had moved from her hometown of Chicago to take a job at Sophisticated Data. So as they drove over the the 2 lane count. So as they drove over I don't know what is happening today. So as they drove over the 2 lane country roads to meet Shirley's co-workers for the company party, Marcelli and Webb knew nothing about Forsyth. When they pulled into the public park where employees and guests were laying out their picnics and setting up a volleyball net, the scene looked idyllic. A shady pavilion set between tall pines and the red clay banks of the lake. But soon after they arrived, word started to spread up and down Athens Park Road. There were a couple of niggers down at the lake, laughing and frolicking, having a party with a bunch of white friends. As locals at the park watched Marcelli and Webb hit the volleyball back and forth, they were shocked. Not just by the appearance of 2 black faces in Forsyth, but by the fact that this man and woman didn't seem to realize where they were or just how much danger they were in. Melvin Crow's branch of the family added an E at some point, but in Oscarville, everybody knew that he was blood kin to Bud, Azzy, and May Crow. Melvin's father, Burton, was 9 years old in 1912 and had grown up with the OB and OV twins, brother, who were among the siblings May had been sent to fetch on the day she was attacked. As a son of old Oscarville, born in 1929, Melvin Crow had learned the story of May's death not as a legend, but as something his father, uncles, grandparents, and cousins had all witnessed firsthand and told him about many times. So when Crow heard the rumors and drove down to see for himself, he could hardly believe his eyes. There, less than a mile from the spot where May had been found with her skull bashed in, where she had sickened and died, and where Ernest Knox had first confessed his crime, stood 2 black people, holding hands and wading knee-deep in the waters of Lake Lanier. Crow watched them through somewhat bleary eyes since, according to his neighbors, he customarily spent much of his Saturday drinking, then driving around the area, sometimes stopping by to see friends. Unemployed, sound like. Crow had been doing exactly that all morning, and after catching sight of Marcelli and Webb, he drove to the house of his friend Bob Davis, and together with a friend of Davis's named Brian Williams, they started plotting to do something about what they'd seen. Before they drove back down Athens Park Road, Davis grabbed a pistol. The idea, Crow said later, was to scare the black couple away. We talked about shooting out their tires. For anyone who missed his point, he added, "I don't like colored people." Marcelli got his first inkling of trouble when he heard the crunch of gravel under the tires of a pickup truck rolling slowly past the grassy picnic area. The vehicle cruised by several times that afternoon, always disappearing up the dirt road leading out of the park, only to return a few minutes later. When at one point Marcelli ran over near the truck to get a volleyball, he said he found the driver looking at me with a mean face. As a black man living in Georgia, Marcelli had seen scowling white men many times before. "I didn't pay much attention," he said. "I just thought maybe he'd look like that all the time." But around 6:15 p.m., as Marcelli and Webb were shaking the sand out of their towels and packing the trunk of their car, the same truck appeared again, and this time the driver pulled sideways across the road, blocking their exit from the park. A middle-aged white man sat behind the wheel, glaring at them. Without a word, he gunned the engine and drove off. With the light fading, Marcelli and Webb said goodbye to the rest of Webb's friends and got in their car, eager to put the whole episode behind them and relieved at the thought of getting back to Atlanta. But as they drove up the hill toward the main highway, Webb noticed a huge dust cloud filling the road ahead. At the same moment, inside Melvin Crow's truck, Bob Davis raised his hand, nodded at Crow, and said, "Stop and let me out right here." As Marcelli and Webb drove up the dusty road, struggling to see Webb, suddenly hear a blunt pop, then another, and watched in horrors as Marcelli went limp. Damn. I lost my spot. As Marcelli and Webb drove up the dusty road, struggling to see, Webb suddenly heard a blunt pop, then another, and watched in horror as Marcelli went limp. His body slumping over the steering wheel. I felt a great weakness come over me, Marcelli recalled later. Then I felt a wiggling sensation in my head and neck. I heard Shirley scream and the car seemed to be moving on its own. When she looked over at Marcelli, Webb said, she thought he was dead. The whole left side of his face was covered in blood. She struggled to grab the steering wheel as the car veered, climbed a bank beside the road, then flipped, the engine revving and smoking as the wheels spun. With Marcelli drenched in blood and unconscious in the front seat, Webb dragged herself out through the shattered rear window. As she staggered away from the overturned car and called out for help, she saw a group of men standing on a hill above the road, and as she headed toward them, But when she got closer, Webb was shocked to find out that they were pointing and laughing. Convinced that these were the same men who had just shot Marcelli, a terrified Webb turned and ran back down the road, screaming for someone to help her. A local man named Keaton was working in his yard when he heard the sound of gunshots, the squeal of car tires, then shattering glass. He ran to look and found what he described as an extremely distraught black woman coming up the road toward him. "Would you help me? Would you protect me?" Shirley Webb pleaded. "And please help him," she said, pointing back toward the wrecked car. Keaton told the woman that he would instruct his wife to call the police. When she begged him to drive her back to the pavilion so she could find her friends, he repeated that his wife was going to call the police. Leaving Shirley Webb standing in the road, still for all she knew, in the sights of armed white men, Keaton turned back toward his house, shaking his head and saying, "There's nothing more I can do here." This is 1980. As Melvin Crow stood in his driveway, staring in the direction from which the shots had come, Bob Davis came crashing through the woods behind his house. Melvin could see that Davis had taken off his shirt and was wrapping a pistol inside it as he ran deeper into the pines. A few minutes later, Davis walked back empty-handed. Still wide-eyed and gasping for breath, he looked at Crow and said, "I think I killed the black son of a bitch." Not even fear of prosecution was enough to quiet Melvin Crow on the subject, or to dampen his pride when police investigators arrived at his house the day after the shooting. Detective Randy Sims started the investigation at Crow's front door only because it was the closest house to the spot where glass from a shattered windshield still littered the street. When he and another officer introduced themselves, Crow blurted out, "I'm not telling you anything. Somebody has to keep these niggers out of Forsyth County." I'm glad it happened. The exchange convinced investigators that Crow was not just a run-of-the-mill Georgia racist, but saw himself as a defender of the whites-only rule that had been in effect for nearly 70 years. Excuse me, y'all. Trying to learn this camera stuff out. But anyways. The exchange convinced investigators that Crow was not just a run-of-the-mill Georgia racist, but saw himself as a defender of the whites-only rule that had been in effect for nearly 70 years. Having instigated the plot to frighten Marcelli and Webb and having driven Bob Davis to the scene, Crow was clearly involved in the crime, and as the officer stood on the lawn listening to what was fast veering toward a confession, they had reason to think that Crow himself might have been the shooter. But even when Crow realized that he was a suspect, he didn't tell them about Davis or about how he'd seen his friend hiding a pistol in the woods. Melvin fell silent when asked if he knew who'd pulled the trigger. Having lived in Forsyth all his life, he seemed to fear the consequences of identifying a person unknown. "I'm not going to tell who did it," Crow said to Officer Sims. "I'm not going to tell. Because if I do, I'll get burned out." The full story of the shooting came to light during the court testimony of Ethel Crow, an elderly aunt with whom Melvin lived. Born in 1911, Ethel, too, was a child of old Oscarville, and from earliest childhood, she had learned the tale of May Crow's rape and murder with its lesson about the monstrous lust of black men. As a member of the wary, insular community of farmers in Oscarville, she had seen unimaginable changes come to the county since the 1920s. What she hadn't ever seen in 1980 was a black person coming toward her on Athens Park Road or stopping right outside her front door. But that's what happened in the minutes after Bob Davis raced into the woods to hide the gun with which he'd shot Miguel Marcelli. Called to testify about that day, Ethel Crow described seeing and hearing a black woman crying in the road. According to news reports, Crow's lips began to quiver and she spoke in between quiet sobs as a courtroom filled with local whites sat in silence. The lawyer for the prosecution asked her what she'd done to help Shirley Webb. "Nothing," Ethel Crow told the jury. "Nothing like that ever happened at our house before." There in her own driveway stood a trembling, blood-spattered woman presenting Melvin Crow's aunt with a frightening choice. She could either go out and help the woman and her injured boyfriend, or she could turn away and pretend that she had never heard the gunshot, the car crash, or the woman's cry for help. Asked what she did when she found Shirley Webb sobbing outside her kitchen window, Ethel Crow stared into her lap and shook her head. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing. I was scared." Dr. Michael Farno, chief surgeon at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, testified that Miguel Marcelli had been shot behind the left ear with a .38 caliber bullet, and that the entrance wound was close enough to his brain that Marcelli may suffer neurological problems in addition to injuries already sustained. After emergency surgery, Marcelli recovered, and he was well enough to testify at the trials of Melvin Crow and Bob Davis and to tell of the story of his trip to Forsyth. All white juries found both men guilty of 2 counts of aggravated assault. After almost a century, during which black Georgians had been lynched, shot at, beaten, and burned out of Forsyth, and during which untold acres of black-owned land had been quietly plundered, 2 whites had finally been arrested and convicted for stalking and shooting a black man. Rather than acknowledging that Crow and Davis were the first and only men to face such consequences in the county's long history of white terrorism, the Gainesville Times congratulated the juries on dispelling the myth of Forsyth's bigotry and intolerance. 12 men and women exploded that myth by convicting Davis and Crow, the paper said, reiterating the old claim that the county's unusually white complexion is not a preoccupation. It is simply a happenstance. Locals were relieved when the convictions brought an end to all the media attention and sent news truck back down Highway 400 to Atlanta. But the peace and quiet didn't last long. 7 years later, a much larger group of African Americans made the trip north, this time crossing the county line not by chance but by choice. They came to publicly protest 75 years of segregation in the county and to demand a new era of peace and brotherhood in Forsyth. The whole nation soon learned that there were whites in the county who considered themselves exempt from Brown v. Board of Education, from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and from a host of federal laws against racial discrimination in housing and employment. When a double-file line of black and white civil rights marchers appeared on Bethel View Road on January 17, 1987, and began walking toward the coming courthouse, a raucous army of Forsyth residents was waiting to meet them. Just like their grandparents and great-grandparents, they were convinced that they had a right to live in an all-white community. As photographers and news crews set up their cameras, the crowd erupted into a chorus of rebel yells and unfurled a long white banner. Racial purity, it said, is Forsyth's security. Okay. I mean, it's crazy how people say like these things happened so long ago. And here, this is 1980 that this happened, right? So this was what, like shy of like 40 years ago. You know, I was born in 1992. So this is just 12 years later I was born, you know. And it's not like these ideologies and these hateful, you know, feelings, whether could be warranted in some way, whether you have them, you know, and you feel justified within them, you know, it doesn't give you the right to extend that outside of your space into others, especially when it's one of those things where it's like you're intentionally causing, you know, division. It's one of those things where it's like the Bible said, I read in the scripture where it says, when you go into someone's house or when you break bread with someone, right, and they say that they don't eat something or drink something, we're not supposed to sit there and judge them, you know, because you allow yourself to partake in that and they don't, because that's when the Bible says that, you know, God gives everyone a measure of faith. And so one faith may bring them, for example, to eat pig, where another person's level of faith may not bring them to eat pig. The pig eater shouldn't be mocking and, you know, berating the person who doesn't eat pig because they're different, just like the person who doesn't eat pig shouldn't do so in the vice versa, you know? And so it's one of those ordeals where it's just like, it sounds like a cliche, but it's, you meet people where they at. You literally meet people where they at. You don't force, you know, your way into people's spaces. You don't force people into aspects, you know, don't force them into basically doing stuff that they really don't want to do. You got to let people breathe, be themselves. You know what I'm saying? At some point, maybe they will get into it. Maybe they won't, but God gives us all free will and autonomy, which means that we have the ability to decide whether we want to do something or not do it, you know. The only person that we will answer to at the end is Jesus. So if you ain't Jesus, leave it alone. All right. So like I said, that's the end of chapter 16. Now we're going to get into chapter 17. Okay. And I'm going to run this video again. My bad, y'all.
Fire rose on the play God. I want playing all the game. Bad. I want playing all the game. Fire rose, how we go? God. Hoof them, cuff them, good hoof buff them. In shoot up like I've hatched them. Mouth shoe bump, he clap back. box them. Look when them group up, shot pop head for the rose. Mini K eat, I go shot them. Boom, 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 boom. How we go? Them easy fi catch circle them with the Mac 10. Fire rose how the play go. Squeeze it butterfly, easy them on a light. Beat it, I'ma fly them dead lullaby. Squeeze chip on a bike, knee lift when I climb. 3 clips just arrive, beat it. Them lily bag a nice, last them butterflies. Wheel it on a bike, squeeze it. But from this, so not try bring me up a life. For the rose we gon' squeeze it, them did that. Circle them and bust them made in the pillar. Killers and ready them and ya falika. Press it up at my glide and I did that. For the rose, rich like bank teller. We are you no size, so it's how we no similar. Aye, he badness big, yeah, mega. Press it up, them a glide and I did that. For the rose, bad. March on, we bama. Hini with them, me find them good a punta cana. Should be bama through the wind and them me pull a fire. Grains up your tail, hot with the think sana. Had to be them a carry, village you mo focus sana. Kasana tell me them not ready, them a big farmer. Finger.
Y'all, I'm over here eating my PBJ. That's why I ended up pausing.
Bad, I want playing all the game. Fire rose, how we go? God, hoof them, cuff them, good hoof buff them. In shoot up, like half hatch gen. Mount shoot up, the glass box them. Look when them group up, shot pop head for the rose. Mini K eat, I go shot them. Boom, 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 how we go? Them easy fi catch circle them with the Mac 10. Fire rose, how the play go? How we go? Squeeze it, butterfly, easy them on a light. Beat it, I'ma fly them dead lullaby. Squeeze chip on a bike, knee lift when I climb. 3 clips just arrive, beat it. But them lily bag a nice, last them butterflies. Wheel it on a bike, squeeze it. But from this, so not try bring me up a life. For the rose, we gon' squeeze it, them did that. Circle them and bust them made in the pillar. Killers and ready them and ya falika. Press it up at my glide and I did that. For the rose, rich like bank teller. We are you no size, or it's how we no similar. Aye, he badness big, yeah, mega. Press it up, them a glide and I did that. Fire rose, bad. March on, we bama. Hini with them, me find them good a punta cana. Should be bama through the wind and them me pull a fire. Grains up your tail, hot with the think sana. Had to be them a carry, village you mo focus sana. Kasana tell me them not ready, them a big farmer. Finger.
Alright, y'all. I'm done eating my my PBJ. We're gonna get into cheddars here, man. Get into cheddars. Let me get a little kombucha, bro. Flush this PBJ down. I might have to every now and then, turn my head from the microphone, cause that kombucha be bringing them burps up. You hear me? Make sure all the cameras right. I'm gonna upgrade my Nikon. I like my Nikon, but it has this timeout feature. I don't sense this. Y'all see this? But it has this motherfucking timeout feature. And are you going up or down? But yeah, it has this whole timeout feature. And the timeout feature, I mean, it's alright if I was like outside, filming or something. I'm outside filming or something, but nah, bro. That's what I get for snatching up my microphone like it's. Hey, can't be snatching this thing up like that. My bad. Why you twisted so slow? Oh, it's because I'm going the wrong way. Y'all, technical difficulties, you hear me? It happens though. I snatched the whole microphone up off the table. You better hold it. Hold your mute. That made me lose my page microphone. Ooh, excuse me. I told y'all that kombucha. It's that kombucha, y'all. It's coming back up. All right. So, like I said, we about to get into this motherfucking chapter 17. 17. Okay. Chat CRT. Make sure we all squared away here. Okay. My bad, Mike. Fine. I didn't mean to snatch you up like that earlier. Chapter 17, y'all. The Brotherhood March, 1987. All right, y'all. We in 1987. 5 years before I was born, which is 1992. Racial violence was making headlines all over the county. It actually says country, my bad, y'all. Racial violence was making headlines all over the country in December of 1986 after 4 black men were beaten by a mob of whites in the Howard Beach section of Queens in New York City. And this says 1986. 4 black men beaten by a mob of whites in Howard Beach section of Queens, New York City. Most people associate lack of slavery, but lack of racism and prejudice and bigotry in New York. Why? I don't know. Wherever there's humans, you're going to have some weird ideologies, okay? Weird. And when I say weird, unaligned to the Most High God. From the depravity of our hearts, I'm telling you, that's what the Bible says. Anyways, a 23-year-old African-American man named Michael Griffin died. Another burp, y'all, excuse me. Michael Griffin died after the gang of a baseball bat-wielding white teenagers attacked him for trespassing across an unwritten racial border. Already badly injured and running for his life, Griffith had sprinted across a busy highway where he was struck by a passing car. In response to the killing, Reverend Al Sharpton led 1,200 demonstrators through the streets of Howard Beach on December 27, 1986, as furious local whites screamed racial slurs and demanded that black protesters get out of their neighborhood. Less than a month after the Howard Beach protests, a man named Chuck Blackburn came up with what he thought was a modest proposal for the people of Forsyth, that all those opposed to fear and intimidation gather for a short march along Highway 9, ending at the Blackburn Learning Center, where he taught karate classes and meditation. Overcoming fear and aggression is a basic theme of martial arts, Blackburn told reporters. And with the march, he wanted to prove that racism is on the wane in Forsyth. Blackburn had moved to coming from San Francisco in the early 1980s, and he had been shocked to learn that none of his black friends from Atlanta would set foot across the Forsyth County line. And so, in January of 1987, Blackburn announced his plan to protest the situation publicly. He called on like-minded residents to mark the 75th anniversary of 1912 with what he called a Brotherhood Walk, which was timed to coincide with the second annual and still highly controversial Martin Luther King Jr. National Holiday, which is his motherfucking birthday. Once local newspapers and radio stations picked up the story, there was a widespread opposition to Blackburn's plan. Once local newspapers and radio stations picked up the story, there was widespread opposition to Blackburn's plan. That sounds completely different. He sent letters to area clergy in hopes that some of their parishioners might join the walk. But Blackburn told reporters only one minister responded, and then he backed down. That minister was Reverend Jim Martin of Shiloh United Methodist, who withdrew his support after his own congregants objected vehemently. Chuck was talking about there being a silent majority who favor brotherly love and who think race doesn't really matter. Reverend Martin said in the days leading up to the Brotherhood Walk, but I don't think he's right. I think he's realized that that's not right. It would take changing the hearts of a lot of people. Blackburn learned just how naive he'd been when the phones at his office started ringing day and night with men and women, young and old, calling to warn of the consequences if he went ahead with the demonstration. The mildest was a caller who said, "I just don't think it's a good idea for you to try to get the niggers to come up here. That's why we live in Forsyth County, to get away from them." An old woman's voice echoed the sentiment and added an overt threat. "You can't change it, no matter how bad or how hard you try," she said. "You're going to have to end up leaving this county or leaving the box." Then there were the men whose voices were laced with such menace that Blackburn and his students armed themselves and posted around the clock guards at his storefront school. "I know someone whose house was burned," one caller said, "so you better watch out." As Blackburn peered out through the blinds and double-checked the door locks, his office phone rang again, and the answer machine clicked to life. Through its little speaker, a man whispered, "I got a 30-06 bullet with your name on it." Fearing for his life, Blackburn canceled the protest on January 9th, telling the Forsyth County News that the threats were much more violent than I thought they would be, and the good folks in this community just aren't ready to stand up for it. Forsyth County is just not ready for it yet. When he announced his decision, the Brotherhood Walk was taken up by a friend of Blackburn's named Dean Carter. Dean Carter was a white construction worker and fellow martial arts enthusiast who lived in Gainesville, where so many of Forsyth's expelled families had resettled. Carter and his wife Tammy also received threats like one from a caller who told them, "After Saturday, you're dead." But they were determined to go ahead, and in the weeks leading up to the protest, Carter joined forces with the veteran Atlanta activist Jose Williams, who had been a key member of Martin Luther King Jr.'s inner circle during the civil rights battles of the 1950s and 60s. When Williams agreed to lend his name and experience to the cause, the Brotherhood March and the shocking story of the Forsyth expulsion started to gain national media attention. Faced with so much negative coverage, civil rights leaders and Cummings did what they had always done. Rather than acknowledge and confront the county's history, they pointed to racially motivated attacks elsewhere in the state and the country and asked why Forsyth, of all places, was suddenly being singled out. "We haven't had any incidents up here as far as race is concerned that I can remember, and I've been here since 1956, said County Commissioner James Harrington, a surprising claim given that only 6 years earlier, Atlanta firefighter Miguel Marcelli had been gunned down by Melvin Crow and Bob Davis. Harrington must have also read newspapers reports about an attack in November of 1986 when 5 Mexican construction workers in the county to work for a Cumming man were beaten by 4 men and a woman who broke into their house. The Mexican men said the whites threatened to kill them unless they left the county. In the days leading up to the march, the dominant tone of the Forsyth County News was annoyance, along with an unabashed desire to get the whole thing over with as soon as possible. In a column titled, "Let's Get On to Better Things," editor Laura McCullough argued that it was Forsyth's residents, not black students of Georgia, who were being victimized, by the negative attention. By the time this newspaper is printed, the March for Freedom or Brotherhood or martial arts or whatever will be thankfully over. Maybe then we can become Forsyth County again. You remember, the sleepy town north of Atlanta that has its own problems with land rezoning and bulging schools. A similar note of irritation came from Cumming Forsyth County Chamber of Congress head Roger Crow, another distant relative to May Crow. On the Thursday before the march, as tensions rose all over the county, Crow stood on the steps of the courthouse and made a public statement on behalf of the business owners of Forsyth. decrying the violent threats of outsiders, as well as the march organizers themselves. We do not condone needless efforts to create havoc, Crow said, made by those with questionable motives, particularly those from outside the confines of the county. There are those who would portray Forsyth County as a lawless, racist, and anachronism, he said, but this simply is not so. Anachronism. I need to look that word up. Circle that and come back to it. Anachronism. I feel like Forsyth County shall not be maligned by inaccurate they broke this up weird. Aspersions cast by a reckless few. While politicians and businessmen fretted over the damage being done to Forsyth's reputation, others were busy recruiting members of a group they called the Forsyth County Defense League. They responded to the Brotherhood March not with editorials and news conferences, but by loading pistols, tying lengths of ropes into nooses, and planning a white power rally for the day of the march. Signs were posted and flyers tucked under windshield wipers all over Cumming, calling on whites to protest against the race mixers march on Forsyth County. While Sheriff Wesley Walraven told reporters that the Defense League represented a small radical element, the wording of the announcement tapped into much broader currents of fear and anxiety in the white community, which had origins in the steady northward growth of Atlanta. By the 1970s, Georgia's interstate highway system had extended the margins of the state capital farther and farther from its old downtown and put the Atlanta suburbs right on the doorsteps of Forsyth. Just as Charlie Harris's ill-fated railroad had promised to bring new ideas, new people, and new commerce into the foothills at the turn of the 20th century, by the time Chuck Blackburn proposed his Brotherhood Walk in 1987, droves of Atlanta professionals, like my parents, were moving to lake houses inside the county. Not my parents, the author parents. Along with all that new energy and new capital, the freeway brought with it the possibility that Forsyth might soon see the arrival of large numbers of black residents. And they don't want that. They don't want that. Organizers of the White Power rally played on white's fears. Donald Trump did that, both of his motherfucking presidential campaign elections. But anyways, organizers of the White Power rally played on white fears of the city and presented the gathering not only as a celebration of white power, but as a defense of the racial purity that had defined Forsyth for as long as anyone could remember. We are protesting against race mixers like Chuck Blackburn, the Carters, the Forsyth County News, the Gainesville Times, and other outside agitators and communist race mixers who want to defile our community. You know, a common term that I hear thrown around loosely, especially with people that would be seen more on the extreme end of their political views, or even when when protests transpire, I don't know what it is, but this term agitators starts to flow around loosely. Like every protest, I mean, look at it. The George Floyd, here in Rochester, we had Daniel Prude, and every politician that was in opposition of the protest because they felt that it was, detrimental to the economic value in Rochester, right? They all kept referring to like agitators starting the protest, agitators commencing violence at the protest, agitators. Like agitators is always thrown around, and it's thrown around so loosely. I don't understand why that is, and I wonder. But anyway, let's continue. Let me make sure that camera stays on. But anyways, If such a call to arms was meant to mobilize white residents of the county, it worked. 2 days before the Brotherhood March, the editors of the Gainesville Times predicted that about 100 members of each group are expected to demonstrate. But just like local law enforcement, they seriously underestimated the crowd. Appalled by the thought of race mixers invading Forsyth, on the morning of January 17, 1987, more than 2,500 whites gathered at the intersection where the Brotherhood March was to begin. By 10 a.m., a gas station on the corner of Bethelview Road and Highway 9 was teeming with pickup trucks and men in white sheets, camouflage, and hunting gear. Frank Shirley, a county resident and head of the committee to keep Forsyth County white. That's the actual committee to keep Forsyth County white. Wow. Assured the reporters that most of the demonstrators are from Forsyth. As a chartered bus filled with civil rights marchers set out from the King Center in Atlanta and made its way up Highway 400, Shirley took a turn with the megaphone and whipped up the crowd chanting, "Go home, niggers! Go home, niggers!" Whites milling around the parking lot were treated to the day's first highlight when a silver-haired man in a suit and trench coat appeared, waving to the crowd as he leaned on a cane and limped up Bethelview Road. His name was J.B. Stoner, and for decades he had been one of the South's most notorious white supremacists. His defense of segregation grew even more legendary in 1977 when he was indicted for the 1958 bombing of Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham. Wow. J.B. Stoner. Okay. Indicted for 1958 bombing of Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham. According to court testimony, Stoner targeted Reverend Fred Shuttleworth for the leading role he and Bethel members had played in civil rights protests in Alabama, and Stoner had instructed his men to place 16 sticks of dynamite outside the church in a burning paint can. Before it could detonate, the improvised bomb was noticed by a passerby, and men guarding Reverend Shuttlesworth rushed it into the street. The explosion seconds later rattled windows all over North Birmingham and left a crater-sized hole in 28th Avenue. Damn. That's crazy. I'm glad they got it away from the church. After evading prosecution for years, Stoner was finally convicted in 1980 and sentenced to 10 years in prison for ordering the bombing. But after serving 6 years of his sentence, he was granted early parole in 1986 November, just 2 months before the White Power rally in Forsyth. Now, I want to stop here because this man was sentenced, it said, to 10 years. Yeah. Convicted to 10 years. Convicted and sentenced to 10 years for the bombing. Interesting. But only served 6 years of his sentence. 6 years. $10 years seemed light for a bombing. Like, that's attempted murder, my brother. But what I think is interesting is that a lot of people they push this fallacy, right, where it's like liberals and Democrats and blue, and it's just all this, gang banging. But they say one side is just so lenient on law, there's no toughness on crime. And then this occurred in 1986. So this was 2 years before the shift in politics where Democrats went from seeming like they were proponents of showing leniency in the carceral system. So meaning that they were pro prison reform. They were pro things like furlough programs. So like Dukakis, right? Michael Dukakis ran for the presidential election of 1988. This bombing by J.B. Stoner occurred in 1986, 2 years before Michael Dukakis ran for president. Michael Dukakis, if anybody remember, ran against George Bush, the daddy, and lost. He was winning. But this is when people kept saying, like, oh, lenient on crime, lenient on crime, lenient on crime. And the reason why I want to stop here is because a lot of people, especially when it comes to the city, right? But a lot of people have these fallacies, like when they hear prison reform, right? They falsely associate this idea as like the people that benefits from this, mostly from prison reform and bail reform and jail reform and all these carceral system reform. They think that the people who disproportionately benefit from these systems are colored people, black people, Latinos people, but mostly black people. Because most of the time when people think of a crime, they think of black people. I mean, it's preposterous, but it's actually paradoxical, you know. The amount of people who motherfreaking falsely believe that black people commit over 50% of the crimes in the United States of America, although we only make up 14% of the U.S. population. And of that 14%, there's children in the geriatric community and the incarcerated and those that serving overseas. So when you really look at the amount of black people in the United States committing crime, that percentage is very low, especially when data says that there are about 1% of every group of people that commit crimes. So black people are make up about 14%, and we just laid out all the things that could make that 40% smaller, because you take into consideration children. I mean, what 3-year-old is out here committing, you know what I'm saying? Most of the times, old people age out of crime, so you remove old military, you know, people serving time in the carceral system. The percentage of black people that could be out here committing crime, that percentage is small, right? That population is small, and of that is 1%. But people believe that black people just out here wreaking havoc, committing all types of crimes, right? Then they think like, oh, bail reform is freeing all these black people, freeing all these black people. It's freeing all these Mexicans and black people. It's freeing all these Mexicans and black people. It's freeing all these Mexicans and black people and black people. It's freeing all these criminals. And then they say it so much to where they interchangeably say black criminal, Mexican, black criminal, Mexican. It's crazy, to the point where you could hear one or the other and you're going to think one or the other anyways. You hear criminal, your brain going to go black, or your brain might take you Mexican. You done heard it so much. It's part of your program. So anyways, but here it is to show that this man, J.B. Stoner, who took dynamite and attempted to blow up a church, and the hole was so huge, like it could have really, you know, did some damage if he actually succeeded. But this man was sentenced to 10 years and got 4 years shaved off. He only served 60% of his sentence before he was released on parole. The reason why I want to highlight this is to show y'all this is a criminal. J.B. Stoner is a white criminal who benefited off of the existence of parole. Well, if you serve your time, and we get feedback of good behavior, you could be rewarded with parole. You know, you participate in some activities, get a job while you're in there, you know, acquire some education, you know, get some vocational training on there, you get some certificates, look good, and then we could process you out. And now this man was sentenced to 10 years of prison for ordering that bomb, but after serving 6 years of his sentence, he was granted early parole in November of 1986, just 2 months before the White Power rally. Now, mind you, I'm gonna keep reading, but this book is just gonna talk about how this criminal made parole, got out, and then just kept performing criminal activities. But then people associate in their anti-bail reform and prison reform and all this other stuff because they're like, you're just gonna have all these black criminals wreaking havoc. You're just gonna have all these black criminals wreaking havoc. This man was released. And then they released him early. They probably was like, you were on great behavior. Get out. But we're going to keep reading so y'all can see how he was not on good behavior. And then he was like, he furthered in his criminality. Because when he show up at this motherfucking rally in, 1987, I think it said. Yeah, 1987. They talking about this man had a cane and stuff. Where is that? Talking about this nigga had a cane. The bombing of Bethel Church was in 1958, but he didn't serve time and was convicted until 1980. So then a little 20 years later. Oh my gosh. Anyways, let's continue. Let's just see. I just want y'all to see, because people think they freeing all these black criminals. This man white, and he was freed, And I say all this to say, white people disproportionately benefit off of the systems that exist, the legislative reforms. Y'all disproportionately benefit from them. I know, looking outside or, looking at yourself, you're just like, dang, I ain't in the greatest position right now. Ain't no way, It's gotta be all these black people. Look at Jay-Z and Kanye West. They're living lives lavishly. Black people is just on top of the world. Because these two black people you see on TV, But at the end of the day, we all struggling. And when y'all vote against stuff, or y'all vote for stuff, under the idea that you're hindering somebody else, ultimately you end up hindering yourself. Remember, we talked about, I think I put my book back. Oh, I didn't. We talked about In Dying of Whiteness, the story, the ethnographic story of a white man who was interviewed. And he had motherfucking health problems, bro. This nigga had health problems. And this nigga was hooked up to the oxygen machine. He was dying. And when he was interviewed and asked, like, hey, would you vote for, universal health care type legislation, or vote for politicians that is for those things? And he was like, what? You crazy? Hell no. You know who benefit off those? Mexicans and black people, all the welfare queens and all that. Mind you, this man was dying. The way it described him, it was just like, damn. You on your dying breath and you still hateful. Like, how is that even, And then you do all that to hurt somebody else and ultimately end up hurting yourself, because later on, it goes to say that man ended up dying. Literally, he died from his health problems that he couldn't afford to tend to. You see what I'm saying? On top of the fact that people love to talk about black on black crime and violent crime and, the highest violent rates when it comes to the violent rates, period, in black people, the highest ones is gun violence, and people just, black people, crime, and violence, especially crime, violence, black people, they love them three words together. But reading this book, Dying of Whiteness, I kind of want to read this one next, but we got to finish Blood at the Root. But reading this book, I have learned, right, even right here, it says that although most people believe that a lot of violent crimes happens at the hand of homicides by black people, in fact, it goes unnoticed, but a great portion of violent crimes as it revolve around gun violence actually revolves around suicide amongst white men. There are so many white men taking their own lives with firearms that those numbers supersede black people committing homicide. Now, I'm not saying that like tit for tat. I'm saying these are data points that go unnoticed. And honestly, a lot of information as it pertains to poor, working class, white people, or like under the poverty line type of white people, like these are white people that's probably like people would associate like trailer home, you know, living on some type of government assistance and, you know, stuff like that. But a lot of their issues go unnoticed because, one, the way society sees, like, who cares about white people? You know? Because you had this percentage of elitists, they, you know, using divide and conquer, got us pit against each other. So now it's like you just generalize all white people, sum them all up together, be like, them white people living lavishly. They living better than black people. And there's some white people out here that they live in, baby, it's rough. I wouldn't want to live like that. I got kinfolk, you know, white relatives. God bless them, you know. Like, there's just things that we aren't privy to because we don't have access to. I done seen white poverty. It's nasty. Poverty looks nasty for any group. But the thing with white poverty is that it goes unnoticed. It goes unnoticed in data points. I mean, even in major cities, there's white people that live in Chicago. There's white people that live in Detroit. There's white people that live in New York City. There's white people that live in Rochester. There's white people that live in St. Louis. And a lot of times the percentage is almost like 50-50. It's almost neck and neck. You see what I'm saying? But they go unnoticed because it's like sex cells, you know, blood cells. Because society don't really give a damn about white people, you know, putting Billy Bob shot and murdered John Steve, you know, it's not going to get the that if you put, you know, like Taekwon shot mother freaking some gangbangers on the corner of Jefferson Avenue. You see what I'm saying? Like, people just going to tune in because they like, what? Dang, Taekwon shot them. Taekwon probably didn't even shoot nobody. That's probably not even homie's name, but because media painted that picture, and for some reason, black and violence is juicier than white and violence. It's like all them white kids that get funneled through the system, the children's system, the foster system, and all that stuff, and CPS and all that. They just go unnoticed. Why? Because nobody really cares about white kids. But they'll tune in for some color people, even if it's like on some, I don't even care about them, but they're just like, see, I told y'all where them black people live. It's rough. Look at that. That black mom child missing. It's because of the neighborhood she lives in. People be watching the news like that. But anyways, 1988, Michael Dukakis, he was running for Democrats, and he was viewed as lenient on crime. George Bush was running as a Republican. He was viewed as hard on crime. George Bush was losing, he freed Willie Horton, which was a black man who on paper would not have been released in no other circumstances. It seemed like it was on some government strategy type of ordeal that they released Willie Horton. It's kind of like how they be talking about all these project things and how certain people be putting certain people into presidents and prime ministers and other leadership roles. Yeah, that's what it seemed like with the George Bush. Like, he had some help because they released Willie Horton. The news media played on white anxiety, white fear. They made that man look extra dark skinned. And then they started pushing the, oh my goodness, it's a sadistic, satanic, demonic black man out here wreaking havoc on white people. He done broke into this white lady house. He raped her, brutalized her, just beat her, then turned around and beat her boyfriend. And he a white man too. And the white people was just like, oh my goodness. And then at the same breath, George Bush come out talking about, see, this is why you need to vote for me, because Duke Cock is over there releasing sex fiends, with violent tendencies, and they black too, and they want to come into these white neighborhoods and terrorize y'all. So y'all gotta vote for me. Next thing you know, the man who was pro the furlough program, pro having educations in the prison system, enhancing people's lives, so when they go in there and they come out, they actually prepare for society. Yeah, that guy lost to the guy that started turning some things through legislation and getting rid of them same programs and services. Yeah. These tactics just keep repeating themselves, playing on white anxiety. That was the whole point of me mentioning that, but let's continue. All right. Having made the headlines as an unrepentant racial terrorist, the newly freed stoner arrived at Bethel Road as a kind of celebrity bigot. It was swarmed by young Forsyth men eager to shake his hand and get his autograph. Asked by a reporter why he come to Forsyth, Stoner said, to aid God. Oh, the blasphemy. God don't need no help. He don't take counsel nor aid from man. This nigga said to aid God in getting rid of the Jew, part Jew, and nigger. You bring in the niggers and you bring in AIDS and drugs. We don't want AIDS and drugs, he added as the crowd roared its approval. And we don't want niggers. To hundreds of people gathered around him, Stoner embodied the never say die fight against racial integration. Even though by 1987 most segregationists had conceded that battle decades before, Stoner was a walking anachronism to the millions of people who would see his face on the evening news that night. A hate-spewing, church-bombing racist who seemed to have stepped right out of the 1950s. But in the parking lot of Jim Wallace's gas station, where the defenders of white Forsyth waited to do battle with the approaching King Center protesters, J.B. Stoner walked among his kind and was given a hero's welcome. Once the excitement of Stoner's entrance died down, the crowd was ready for the real action to begin. County Sheriff Wesley Walraven had roped off a section of a nearby pasture, and he ordered the Defense League's supporters to move their rally into the designated area. As they reluctantly made their way toward the field, waving rebel flags and carrying signs that said, "Keep Forsyth white," Walraven saw just how much larger the counter-protest was than anyone had predicted. Bonnie Pike, an agent of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, later admitted that as the thing began to swell, we realized we didn't have enough manpower. The government never has enough manpower, which is exactly why I tell people, if you want to dismantle the government, you know what I'm saying, especially when it comes to the criminal justice system and these court systems, flood them by not accepting guilty pleas because they benefit on guilty pleas. You motherfucking waive every right that you have, and you absolve these niggas of doing their motherfucking job, and you assist them, right, by taking guilty pleas. When you have a right to a speedy trial, you have a right to trial. You have a right to a fair trial. You have a right to face your accusers, nigga. You have a right for them to present the evidence before you. You have a right to see that motherfucking evidence. You have a right to question your motherfucking accusers. Do your job, man. Your job, as in the defendant. Fight it. Take it to trial. Like I told y'all before, if every person that has a case, because most counties has at least, a workload that they cannot handle. So if every caseload was to push for trial, I'm telling you, it will motherfucking fall apart because they don't have the manpower and they don't have the funding to hire out the manpower to assist them in the workload. Therefore, your legal grounds of constitutional rights, civil suits increases tremendously because you have a right to speedy trial. But if the motherfucking criminal justice system is so motherfucking flooded to where they can't even process these adequately, you won't get a speedy trial because it'll take them so long to get there. Flood the system, man. That's how you do it. But anyways, just before 11 a.m., a roar rose from the crowd, and Sheriff Walraven turned to see a chartered bus rolling up the ramp from Highway 400. They come into a stop on the shoulder of Bethelview Road. Inside, Hosea Williams stood on the last step of the little stairwell, gripping a megaphone as his field sergeants called out final instruction to the marchers. These were rules Williams had first learned from Dr. King Partner Up. Walk 2 by 2. Stay in line, no yelling, no fighting back, no responding to anything said or done against you, no matter how crude, racist, threatening, or violent. Such non-engagement resulted from King's deep Christian faith and his study of Gandhi's nonviolent protests, but it also grew out of experience. A strict code of discipline and unwavering nonviolence would help make clear to the cameras of the press and to the eyes of witnesses that the marchers were the victims, not the aggressors. Williams knew. So see, this is when people misconstrue King's, ideology and his ways of carrying out his form of revolting. Right? A lot of people just said that he was weak, he was soft, he was too docile, blah, 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 blah. And it said, some of this, it stemmed from his faith, and he, seen from experiences with other, groups. But he also said that it's because he realizes that it paints a clear image to the media, so they can't. And I've seen that before where victims were accused of being aggressors because they were defending themselves. But if you sit there, take the abuse, although you look soft, ultimately your abuser looks exactly as they are, like an abuser. Williams knew, particularly after the carnage of Bloody Sunday in Selma, that an image of white men attacking peaceful protesters could raise more awareness than all the speeches and sermons combined. If a word was said in anger, Williams's team instructed the marchers on the bus. It would not be the protesters who said it. If a fist was raised or a rock thrown, it must not come from within their line. Sheriff Walraven instructed the bus driver to continue past the counter-protest area and unload the passengers farther up the road in hopes of keeping the two groups as far apart as possible. Now I want to show y'all what J.B. Stoner looks like before I go too far ahead. This is J.B. Stoner. When the bus doors open, March leaders stepped down onto the asphalt and out into the gray light of Georgia's famous White County. As their eyes adjusted to the glare, it became clear that the crowd of locals gathered in a nearby field were not spectators, but something much closer to a mob. When they caught sight of Hosea Williams, hundreds clambered over a barbed wire fence and ran toward the marchers. It was commonly believed and widely reported that the peace marchers themselves were all from outside the county. The Forsyth County News said that people from Forsyth were conspicuously absent from the group of Brotherhood marchers. But while the majority of the activists did come from Atlanta, there were exceptions. For there, on Bethelview Road, having waited in our old red Buick half that morning, nervously watching a sea of rebel flags over at the gas station where my mother and father and my 18-year-old sister Rachel. My father got out of the car and said enough to march leaders to make it clear that while he was white, Southern, and a resident of Forsyth, he had come to walk with them and to add his voice to the cause for change. Although they had sat all morning unnoticed by the crowd of counter-protesters, the minute my parents and my sister took their places in line, whites in the crowd started pointing and yelling, "Nigger lovers!" They screamed as my mother and sister stood stone-faced, waiting for the signal to march. "Go back to Atlanta with the rest of them," spat a man a few feet away from my father. "Back to Nigger Town, you white niggers." As the first march for Brotherhood in Forsyth County finally got underway, the counter-protesters gave up all pretense of obeying the sheriff. Let me show y'all the picture. It's Hosea Williams in the middle. Oh, Lord. Jose right here. This is the protest, and then this is like the cops and all that. Walraven admitted to Williams that he had been caught off guard by the large turnout and had only 70 men, including local deputies, state highway patrolmen, and Georgia Bureau of Investigations officers to try to control several thousand people from the White Power rally. Given the size and the feverish excitement of the crowd, an attack came to seem almost inevitable, and law officers focused their efforts on guarding the line of marchers themselves, leaving too few police to watch the counter-protesters on the margins. Only a few hundred yards in the planned walk, furious whites lined both sides of the road, forming a gauntlet through which the marchers had to pass. Walraven directed the driver to pull his bus up next to Hosea Williams, and it crept along at walking speed in an attempt to provide at least some cover. The marchers needed protection because while most people lining the road stood chanting, "Go home, niggers," and "Keep Forsyth white," others started hurling anything and everything they could find, pelting the line of marchers with sticks, clods of dirt, bricks, broken beer bottles, and rocks. After Williams was struck on the side of the head, Sheriff Walraven gathered march organizers and warned them that he could no longer guarantee anyone's safety. Williams, however, was determined to continue that night on news channels around the world. People watched in shock as the gray-bearded 61-year-old winced and ducked the flying rocks, shook his head in disbelief, and carried on. Born in Adipologus, Georgia, in 1926, Jose Williams grew up under Jim Crow. And as a boy of 13, he nearly suffered the same fate as Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel when a mob of whites in Decatur County came to his house and accused him of raping a young white girl. By Williams' own account, his grandfather held him off with a shotgun until a friendly white neighbor interceded to prevent further violence. After serving with an all-black army unit in World War II, Williams was awarded the Purple Heart for injuries sustained during a Nazi bombing. When he came home from the war in 1945, still recovering from his wounds, he was nearly beaten to death in a bus station in Americus, Georgia, for having the audacity to wear his army uniform and for trying to take a drink from the whites-only water fountain. As William put it, I had watched my best buddies tortured, murdered, and bodies blown to pieces. French battlefields had literally been stained with my blood. So at that moment, I realized why God, time after time, had taken me to death's door, then spared my life to be a general in the war for human rights. Amen, brother. Williams went on to become a leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and a close confidant of Martin Luther King Jr., who called Hosea my wild man, my Castro, for his willingness to defy court orders, stare down club-wielding police, and march against even the most dangerous white supremacists. Williams was at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis when James Earl Ray assassinated King in 1968, and in the wake of the murder, he vowed to carry on King's work. More than any other member of the SCLC's leadership, he continued to fight at street level, leading marches and protests throughout the 1970s. Along the way, Williams became a prominent and controversial figure in Atlanta politics, ridiculed by many whites after he was arrested on charges of drunk driving and leaving the scene of an accident. By 1987, nearly 20 years had passed since King's death, and Williams, far from his glory days, was a frequent punchline to racist jokes on the talk radio station of Georgia. But as he walked through a hail of rocks and bottles in Forsyth, he also walked back into the arena of his greatest triumphs and returned to the road where his greatest strength, old-fashioned bravery had always been on display. The more the mob on Bethelview Road screamed and threatened, the more Williams felt in his element. Just as King had taught him, and just as they had done in Birmingham and Savannah, St. Augustine, and Selma, Williams met the violence in Forsyth with nonviolence. Walking toward the county courthouse of Georgia's last bastion of segregation, Williams clutched a megaphone and in his raspy, wavering voice led the marchers in verse after verse. We shall overcome. All around them, officers of the county police and the GBI were making arrests, and when they frisked the handcuffed men, they discovered that many had come to the White Power rally with loaded guns tucked into their jeans and hidden under their jackets. After Walraven told Williams that he had feared a shooting if the demonstration continued, the marchers reluctantly agreed to get back on the bus. As soon as the doors opened and marchers began filing on board, the mob let out a howl of celebration. As a final act of defiance, the bus drove the last few miles to Cumming, and the marchers made a symbolic gesture of walking across the finish line at Blackburn School just outside of town. But as journalist Elliot Jaspin put it, if the gesture was intended to show that the Brotherhood March had triumphed over racism, it persuaded no one. During the long ride back to the King Center, it was clear to everyone involved that they had been defeated by an army of Confederate flag-waving, rock-throwing whites who weren't about to yield territory their ancestors had been defending since 1912. This is going to take more than one afternoon to end 75 years of segregation in Forsyth County. Well, that's a whole motherfucking fact. And if you think otherwise, you're crazy because you might be a little narcissistic too, but that's neither here nor there. Journalists collected reactions to the day's events and spoke with people on all sides of the conflict. Dismayed activists, elated white counter-protesters, and county leaders who claimed that the root of the problem was not Forsyth's history of explosions and racial violence, but the media's unfair portrayal of a peaceful community. Hosea Williams was typically blunt. "I have never seen such hatred," he told a reporter from the New York Times. Excuse me. "I have been in the civil rights movement for 30 years, and I'm telling you, we got a South Africa in the backyard of Atlanta. There were youngsters 10 and 12 years old screaming their lungs out, 'Kill the niggers.' Asked if he planned to return for a second march, Williams said, 'I think I have to go back.' Reverend R.B. Cotton Reader, another veteran of the civil rights struggle, echoed Williams' shock. 'I've been in many such situations,' he said, 'but never one that was any worse.' Spokesman for the Chamber of Commerce, the city of Cumming and local churches quickly went into the damage control mode. Roger Crow of the chamber admitted that the violence was an embarrassment, but he characterized the hundreds of locals who had attacked the marchers as outsiders. See, that's another thing they do. Agitators, outsiders. The ones who are provoking the protest, getting the protest started, agitators. And then the ones that get all violent and start doing all the weird stuff, outsiders. They can't be one of we. So those people never get found because a lot of times they be hiding locally, domestically, but viewed as outsiders. It's crazy. The vast majority of the citizens of Forsyth support the rights of everyone, he said. They're God-fearing, hard-working, and most of them law-abiding. B.V. Franklin of the First Baptist Church concurred, saying, "I don't think what we saw was indicative of the people here," and County Commissioner James Harrington assured reporters that people here don't teach their kids to hate anybody. Even as news stations ran footage of children raising their fists and chanting, "Go home, niggers," the media, with these narratives, love to try to convince you what you see or hear for yourself. It's not real. What they tell you is real. Roy Otwell Sr., the 92-year-old patriarch of one of the county's most prominent families, summed up the wish of most residents, which was that all of those demanding an end to segregation of Forsyth and a reckoning with the county's past would simply drop the subject. If they would let us alone, Otwell said, it would die down and blacks would be more accepted. Otwell had witnessed the events of 1912 with his own eyes as a 17-year-old, and he had lived his entire life in a place that showed no signs of changing. Yet even 7.5 decades after night riders had first terrorized the black residents of Forsyth, Otwell still clung to the idea that the integration of the county was only a matter of time and patience. The march, he believed, had been an unnecessary provocation. In order to claim that most people in Forsyth were innocent bystanders, leaders like Crow and Otwell had to ignore the statements other locals made to protesters. Asked why he had come to the White Power rally, a 34-year-old Forsyth man named William Griffin said, "I figured they could pick a better place to do it than Cumming. My granddaddy helped run the niggers out of here in 1912. They hanged some." Rayford Grindle, who had lived in the county all his life, told a reporter that most people here don't want them to move in. His wife Janice nodded as they stood outside the Second Baptist Church and added, "This has been our home, and having it all white is all we know." Another local man, Ron Seaman, came to the church on horseback, and he made a striking figure at the White Power rally, galloping back and forth with the rebel flag flowing behind him. Asked what he thought about the protesters, Seaman said they ought to have printed up targets and given it to them as they got off the bus. Even among Forsyth residents who stayed home from the rally, there was plenty of support for the Forsyth County Defense League. Kelly Strickland, who lived only a mile from the scene of the violence, wrote to the Governor Joe Frank Harris a few days after the march. "I am tired, Governor Harris," she said. "I just want this all to be over, and I want everyone to leave us alone. I would, without doubt, invite a black person into my home for dinner. I love them and respect them. I just do not prefer to live with them. I am sorry. This is my right." A Forsyth man named Bill Bolton wrote to the governor to decry not the violence that had greeted the marchers, but the suffering whites were enduring as a result. "We, the people of Forsyth County, have been used, abused, and criticized without just reason. Whatever happened to our civil rights? The people in Forsyth County are just trying to carve out a living and build a decent place to raise our families like everybody else. Black, Latino, immigrant, native born, you know. We have not bothered the rest of the world, so why does the rest of the world want to bother us now?" Others wrote to assure the governor, despite news reports to the contrary, that the trouble was the work of outsiders and had nothing to do with Forsyth's history or the majority of residents' feelings towards blacks. As a Mrs. Hartsfield of Cumming put it, "Most of those arrested were not natives. I knew of no one who even ventured into town that day. Forsyth County is by far the friendliest and safest place we could ever imagine. Everyone waves to everyone on the road. This town has kept a low profile, and we have been living in peace and harmony. Until now, we haven't hurt anyone and certainly don't want the whole country to think badly of us. The erasure of Forsyth's violent past has been so complete that most residents believe that Mrs. Hartfield told the governor that there was no place more peaceful and no place less deserving of the outrage that had followed the attacks on the Brotherhood marchers. To people who'd spent their whole lives inside the bubble of racial purity, keeping Forsyth all white seemed like the most natural thing in the world." And that's the end of chapter 17, y'all. I mean, sheesh. Next time we gather together, we will be reading chapter 18. We finally there. We are finally there, y'all. Man. So, to God be the glory. To God be the glory. To God be the glory. To God be the glory for the things He has done. Ding, it's 2:30, all right, y'all. With His power, He has saved me. I love y'all. God bless and peace. With His power, He has raised me.
But. How we go? Fire rose so they play a God. I want playing at the game. Bad. I want playing at the game. Fire rose, how we go? God. Poof them, calf them, poof buff them. Ain't shoot up like a hash them. More shoot up, the black bass them. Look when them group up. Sharp pop head, fire rose, me naked, eat, I'm gonna shot them. Boom. How we go? Yeah, easy to make circle them with the mark 10. Fire rose on the playground. Squeeze it, butterfly, easy them on a light. Beat it, I'ma fly them dead lullaby. Screech it on a bike, kneel it, man a climb. She clip just a right, beat it. Them lean it, bag a nice, last them bag a flies. Wheel it on a bike, squeeze it. From beat it, so not try bring me up alive. Fire rose and we gon' squeeze it, then they die. Circle them a bust them in the pillar. Anyway, then me find them good a punta cana. Should be bomb through the wind and then me pull a fire. Green's up your tail, hot with the tinkasana. Had to be them carry village to my focus. Kasana tell me them not ready, them a big farmer. Finger